All right. All right. Well, everyone, we're now looking at fiscal year 21 and 22 annual work plan. And I wanted to talk and provide a little bit of an update of where we are. And what I mean by that is not where we are financially or in terms of contract, but kind of the general direction as we move forward. What are some things we want to consider? What are some things that USAID, or what are some areas of concern that USAID has? What do we want to focus on in this FY21-22 annual work plan? And what are some of the strategic decisions we need to consider? So I'm going to provide this presentation. For those who may be listening to this as a recording, there may be times that I will put on pause just so I can take questions and continue through the presentation. Well, I was thinking about what are some of the themes that may be driving this work plan. And I would say there's a few. We're going to hear it a lot. We'll continue hearing this, which is adaptive management. And I'm going to group this in kind of two ways. One is operation management. Right now, with COVID-19, we've had to shift a lot of our modalities from remote work and monitoring. It becomes a really interesting idea of how do we monitor for that, and how does that change our communication modalities with the partner, with the government? How does that change even how we work as a team, as a CRS team or as a CRS, MCS, LRO team, and engaging our supervisors or other key stakeholders. So we know that's going to be the realities of what we're going to be facing this year. I should also highlight that it's even changing our relationships with USAID. Last week we had a meeting with the mission director where he had said that they don't anticipate a sense of normalcy for about another year. So that means that at this point, there cannot be any face-to-face interaction amongst the USAID staff unless there's prior written approval. And they can't even be a community face-to-face meetings between USAID staff or embassy staff with non-embassy or USAID staff unless approval has been given by the ambassador himself. So that's really what they're looking at. So we're all trying to figure out how do we do that? So even our relationships with USAID and their ability to come out and monitor, for us to actually sit down and have these meetings face to face are very, very limited to potentially non-existing as we move forward. We also have the changing operational parameters set by the GOE. These changes all the time. We were asked to reduce the number of people in a gathering. We know that with some of the communal violence, that there was kind of a resurrection of the command post authority. There's going to be several different factors in which, as the government of Ethiopia responds to crisis, they're going to be making particular demands of NGOs and civil society on how they can communicate and how they can engage with them. And then continued and exacerbated unreliable communication infrastructure, whether that's internet, whether that's telephone, whether that's communicating in country or communicating outside of country. I think we need to recognize that we'll really need to be looking at adaptive management in those ways. We also will have some livelihood shocks. We talked about this earlier on, where we came up with some contingency plans. So we had what happens if there's continued secondary economic impact of COVID-19? What about pests? Desert locusts, fall armyworm. We saw following the assassination of Achaluon, in late June, the rise of the communal conflict and violence, and then climate-related, especially drought. We're going through some seasonal patterns, El Nino, La Nina. How's that going to affect us? I understand that this year has been one of the saving grace has been, in general, it has been a good year for agricultural production because of seasonality. Now, of course, there's been complications about agricultural inputs with COVID-19 or particular disease, but this year seems to be a relatively favorable weather conditions for fiscal year 20. We don't know what that's going to look like in fiscal year 21. Programmatic, we need to complete some basics. We'll talk about that when we talk about graduation. We're going to really have to be innovative in some of our delivery of services. We're seeing it now by people trying to revisit and using Pico projectors, whether it's that, whether it's doing some video instructions, lots of different things. And to continue, we need to focus on having people establishing their small businesses or their IGAs. That'd be really fundamental as we move forward. And then thinking forward, laying the foundation for LRO2, documentation, adaptations, or strategic resource management. So how can we manage our own resources, but how we may want to mobilize other donors' resources to complement LRO as we move forward. So these are ones that I feel that we want to consider as we keep in the back of our minds. What are those things that we need to take in mind? But we also have to recognize that USAID has some concerns. And I would say more or less there's 3 themes that continue to be recurring themes. And there's 2 new themes that have come out. And those are the ones that we're going to touch now. I'm going to suggest if anybody has any questions on the CRS LRO themes, please note those down or throw those in the communication or into the chat room, as I will be checking that shortly, but I'd like to continue this presentation and then come back and talk about those. But do think about these, take notes, so we're just not talking about the last presentation I do, but try to capture some points through this. So again, please throw any comments or questions that you have on that section. All right, so maybe a little bit bigger. By the way, it's really good to hear from you all. I'm on the course on the other side of the world. So right now, this is what, like 5:30, I guess it was, turned 6 o'clock in the morning. So you may hear my family wake up in the background, but I let them know I've been here. So if you suddenly hear my daughter open up the door and say, "I love you, I'm going to school," you shouldn't be surprised. Graduation of beneficiaries. So the whole project was premised on getting people to graduate from the project. That still remains for USAID and specifically RETA the primary purpose of this project. Now, we have had limited progress on graduation. We've seen that few households have graduated, either have been graduated or self-graduation. And there's been a waning interest of the government to graduate. So really, this is still being a very strongly pushed kind of thing. We still need to have these conversations with the government, and we are going to have a separate slide in terms of how can we continue to provide trainings to the government, provide self or aspiration trainings, but also how we want to shift the conversation to graduation ready. In other words, households completing their activities as per the PIM and not solely relying on the approval from the government to graduate officially people from the program. Another recurring theme we've seen that comes out is the access to finance and to external finance. This language was interesting because it came out of now the household. It came out of the Q3 report response, where also there was a shift to also have a conversation about loan guarantee fund utilization. Yeah. There's a fear that we're going to underutilize those funds. and has asked us to please take action to ensure its full utilization. Again, this is a strategic thing that I want us to talk about, and we'll be doing that in a separate presentation shortly. Let me just kind of, yep. So the third one that's been kind of a recurring theme has really been addressing the midterm evaluations. What they want us to do is please make sure we include those, recommendations in this work plan. That's just great. It's also requesting us to develop a separate action plan. That's been done, and we're asking you to update it and anticipate against reporting against the midterm evaluation action plan. So not surprising, but again, we need to be aware of those. So the three, as I saw it, kind of reoccurring questions of graduation, loan guarantee fund, and midterm evaluation recommendation. There was two kind of hot button issues that kind of came up. These are not surprising. This is, fundamental things. What activities have you not been able to achieve? Reevaluate how essential those are, and then also, and I should say, how essential these are to really, again, the question of graduation. And the last one is to make sure we're trying to incorporate and express that in our work plan for fiscal year 21-22. And the last one is a sustainability and exit plan. I've sent out several emails around this, so we won't go into great detail, but it does appear that we will be asked to prepare and submit a separate sustainability and exit plan document. And so we're looking at that. And I've also had some conversations with Elizabeth Farmer around that also. And the fifth and the last kind of areas that USAID is looking at is really about how are we doing on our budget. This is not surprising. We're coming to the end of, we're entering into our last year and a half for this. Again, we are going to have the no-cost extension. That's going to be another determining factor. We just know USAID is going to be asking us lots of questions around that. So, what is our focus going to be as we go and look at our deadline for August 31st? Well, we're going to have the narrative. We need to definitely make sure we have that narrative. But we also know that USAID, especially RETA, is going to really focus on those questions of targets, LLP targets, and ability to meet those LLP targets. So we're going to be looking a lot closer on the dip. We need to talk about, do we need to revise any LLP targets? Yeah. So how do we want to change those targets? Not so much the why. This isn't going to be like, well, we want to change this because of delays in implementation due to COVID-19. This is going to be like, we wish to change the LLP target to this. And we're changing it to this because it will help us towards graduation. Yeah. So less to short to talk about, we're justifying because of not completing targets, but as much as to talk about how we're going to change our targets. We really want to retain this goal on graduation, but also resiliency as we look at this. And we'll also be doing some kind of top line understanding, especially of programmatic drivers, loan guarantee funds, technical trainings, CVAs. These are the big costing that inform us. The operations definitely inform a lot of the budget, but I may ask that we have some of those conversations once we submit our work plan to USAID. There's nothing that says we submit a costed work plan. So I want us to at least make sure that the decisions we're making are ones that we can afford, but it will not be this in the time that we have this week until we come up with some design issues. The actual budget is one of those things we want to just keep an eye on, the really top major programmatic costs. And here in the remaining part of our meeting, we are going to talk about graduation and access to external finance. What does that mean? I know for some, people may say, well, nutrition, why are we having this conversation around nutrition? Or why are we having these questions around graduation or access to external finance? How does that affect nutrition or youth or gender? It's going to affect us because we're going to have to make some decisions on how are we going to deliver services and what may be some priority services, or how we may want to do some required trainings, but maybe do some mainstreaming of other interventions into those. So again, thank you very much for this. I'm going to turn off the recording, and I'd like to take some questions from you. This is really important that we all have the same understanding on these, because it's going to inform, especially this week, of writing and questioning. So if people could submit their comments,